I was 14 years old when this happened, and I lived with my parents in a very quiet suburban neighborhood in Indiana. It was the kind of place where almost everyone knows each other, silent streets, very little activity at night. That weekend, my parents traveled to visit relatives in another city and decided to leave me home alone for the first time. I was excited at first because it seemed simple, playing games, watching TV, ordering food, and staying up late. They left everything organized, told me not to open the door for anyone, and said they would call me from time to time. During the day, everything was completely normal. I played, ate whatever, and felt fine. But at night, the atmosphere in the house changed a bit. Around 10:30, I was in my bedroom with the lights on, playing on the computer. My bedroom window faced the backyard, which was enclosed by a wooden fence with some trees behind it. It was usually very dark there because the only light came from a distant street lamp. At one point, I noticed a light turning on outside. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to illuminate part of the yard. I found it strange because that light was rarely used and my parents always kept it off. I paused the game and looked out the window to understand what had happened. At first, I didn't see anything, just the partially lit yard. But after a few seconds, my eyes adjusted, and I saw someone. It was a man standing near the fence at the back of the yard. He wasn't doing anything, he wasn't on a phone, wasn't moving. He was just there, completely still, looking toward the house. I immediately felt uncomfortable, because it didn't make sense for someone to be there at that time. He wasn't a neighbor, not someone passing by. He was inside the boundary of the yard near the fence like he had come in from the back. I stood at the window for a few seconds trying to figure out if he was really looking at my room or just in the general direction of the house. But the longer I looked, the more direct it seemed, like he knew exactly where I was. My first instinct was to step away from the window. I took a slow step back, trying not to make any sudden movements. My heart started beating faster and I tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe someone looking for something, maybe someone lost. But nothing made sense. I hadn't heard a gate open or anyone coming in, and the way he stood didn't look like someone who had just arrived. It looked like he had already been there for a while. I stood in the middle of my room in silence, just listening, trying to decide what to do. That's when I heard it. The sound was quiet but clear. A light knock on the wall. I froze instantly. It wasn't a sound from the whole house, not from the door. It was specific. It sounded like it came from the outside wall of my bedroom. I stayed still, trying to be sure I hadn't imagined it. A few seconds later, it came again. 2 short knocks in the same spot. My whole body tensed. That couldn't be a coincidence. I had just stepped away from the window, and now the sound was coming from exactly that spot, as if someone knew where I was inside the room. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it could be a branch hitting the wall, something loose in the wind. But there was no strong wind, and the pattern was too precise. It wasn't random. I took a few more steps back, moving away from the wall, feeling that cold drop in my stomach you can't explain. I looked toward my bedroom door, thinking about leaving, but at the same time I didn't want to make noise and draw attention. The silence returned for a few seconds, and then the knocks came again. This time more spaced out, like someone testing, waiting for a reaction. I stood in the middle of the room, not knowing whether to make noise, call someone, or just run. My first thought was to grab my phone, but for a few seconds I couldn't even remember where I had left it. When I finally found it on the desk, my hands were shaking. I thought about calling my parents, but before doing anything, I went to my bedroom door and pressed my ear against it, trying to hear if there was any movement inside the house too. There was nothing, just that heavy silence and the distant sound of a car passing on the street out front. I decided to step into the hallway slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. Each step felt too loud. When I left the room, I glanced quickly toward the living room and the kitchen. Everything looked normal. The lights were just as I had left them. No sign that someone had entered through the front of the house. Even so, I felt like I wasn't alone. It was more of a feeling than anything concrete. I stood there for a few seconds trying to decide whether to go to the living room or back to my room. And that's when I heard it again. This time not on the wall. It came from the window. The sound was different now. Not dry knocks on the wall. It was lighter, like someone tapping on the glass with their fingertips. A short tap, pause, then another. My stomach dropped instantly. That couldn't be anything natural. I was in the hallway, but I could clearly hear it coming from my bedroom. I stood there for a few seconds trying to decide whether to go back or not. part of me wanted to pretend nothing was happening, but another part needed to see. I took a deep breath and walked back, step by step, trying not to make noise. When I reached my bedroom door, I stopped before entering. The sound stopped again. I placed my hand on the wall and listened. Nothing, just silence. I slowly pushed the door open and looked inside. The window was exactly how I had left it, with the curtain partially open. I stepped closer, my heart racing, and looked toward the yard. But no one was visible there at that moment. The light that had turned on earlier was still on, illuminating part of the fence, but the spot where the man had been looked empty now. That didn't bring relief. It only made it worse. It felt like he could be closer than before. I stood there, staring at the yard, trying to understand if he had left or just moved out of my view. The light was still on, but it didn't illuminate everything. So there were several dark areas where someone could be hiding. I thought about closing the curtain completely, but at the same time I didn't want to lose sight of the outside. That's when I noticed something else. The window wasn't fully closed. There was a small opening at the bottom, just a few centimeters, like someone had forced it slightly without making noise. I was sure I had closed it before. My entire body tensed instantly. I took a step back automatically without even thinking. And then I heard it. Not from outside anymore, from inside the house. A soft sound, like someone brushing against something in the hallway. I turned my head immediately, trying to locate where it came from. It wasn't loud, but it was clear enough not to be imagination. That changed everything. Until then, I thought he was just outside. Now, I wasn't sure where he was anymore. I stood completely still for a few seconds, trying to listen again. My heart was pounding so hard it almost got in the way. I took 2 slow steps toward the bedroom door and looked into the hallway. It was dark, with only a faint light coming from the living room ahead. Nothing moving, nothing visible, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, like someone was there just waiting. I thought about running out of the house, but the idea of passing through the living room without knowing where he was froze me. Then I heard a very soft sound from the kitchen. It wasn't something I could identify right away, just a shift, like an object being touched or moved slowly. I began backing up automatically, returning to my room without taking my eyes off the hallway. I didn't want to stay exposed. Once inside, I closed the door as quietly as possible and leaned against it, trying not to make noise. My breathing was short and I couldn't think clearly. I only knew one thing at that moment. He wasn't outside anymore. I stayed pressed against the door for a few seconds, trying to control my breathing and think about what to do. My first instinct was to call someone, but I knew I couldn't make noise. I slowly picked up my phone and lowered the screen brightness as much as possible. I thought about calling my parents, but the idea of someone hearing my voice on the other side of the door froze me. So I decided to send a message first, typing quickly, explaining that someone was in the house. While I was doing that, I stopped for a second, because I heard something on the other side of the door. It wasn't a clear step. It was more like a presence moving closer. I froze. The sound wasn't loud, but it was very close, like someone was right outside in the hallway near my door. I stared at the doorknob, waiting for any movement. And then it came. A soft touch. Not a knock, not someone trying to open it. Just a touch, fingertips against the wood of the door. Once, then silence. I didn't move. A few seconds later, another touch in the same spot, as if the person knew exactly where I was standing on the other side. I kept staring at the door, unable to move. My hand was still holding the phone, but I stopped typing. I didn't want to make any sound. The silence after that second touch became heavy, like the person on the other side was waiting for a reaction. I tried to breathe as slowly as possible, almost holding my breath. A few seconds passed, and then I heard something that made it worse. A faint dragging sound, like someone pressing their ear against the door. It wasn't loud, but close enough to remove any doubt. I felt a strong urge to run, to open the window and jump into the yard, anything to get out of there. But the idea of opening the window and facing him outside didn't feel safe either. I was trapped, not knowing what to do. And then the doorknob moved. Very slowly. It wasn't someone trying to break in or force it. It was a slow movement, like someone testing whether it was locked. I held my breath instantly. The doorknob stopped, and then tried again with a little more pressure. My entire body locked up when it stopped moving again. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I expected some immediate reaction, like him forcing the door or knocking harder, but nothing happened. A few seconds passed, far too long, and then I heard footsteps moving away down the hallway. They weren't fast, They were slow, controlled, like the person wasn't in any hurry. I stayed pressed against the door, not moving, just listening until the sound disappeared completely. I didn't leave that spot for a long time. I don't even know how long. At some point, I gathered enough courage to send a message to my parents and also call emergency services, speaking as quietly as I could. The police arrived after a while that felt like forever. When they entered the house and searched, they found no one. No forced entry, no clearly open windows, nothing out of place except for my bedroom window, which was slightly unlatched. They said it could have been someone trying to break in who gave up. But to this day, what stays with me isn't that. It's the way he moved. The knocks on the wall, the tapping on the window, then the touch on the door. Like he knew exactly where I was the whole time, even without seeing me. Story 2. I was 15 years old when this happened, and I lived with my parents in a small town in rural Ohio. It was the kind of place where almost everything is calm. Quiet streets, longtime neighbors, and not much happening during the day. My parents worked outside the home, so it was normal for me to get back from school and stay alone for a few hours until they returned. I was used to it and had never had any problems. That day I got home around 3 in the afternoon like usual. The weather was normal, slightly overcast, nothing unusual. I walked in through the front door, threw my backpack on the couch and went straight to the kitchen to grab something to eat without thinking much. When I entered the kitchen, the first thing that caught my attention was the back door. It was slightly open, not wide open, but clearly not closed the way it should have been. That made me stop immediately. I stood there for a few seconds staring at it, trying to understand if that was normal. But it wasn't. My parents always insisted on keeping that door locked, especially when no one was home. And I was sure that when I left in the morning it had been closed. Not just closed, locked. That wasn't something I would easily forget. I felt that immediate discomfort, but still tried to find a simple explanation. Like someone had come by for some reason. I stood there for a few seconds just looking at the door, trying to convince myself there was a simple explanation. Maybe one of my parents had come home for something and left quickly. Or maybe I had actually forgotten to lock it. But the more I thought about it, the less it made sense. My parents always told me if they were coming home and I hadn't received any message. And forgetting to lock it wasn't something I usually did, precisely because they always emphasized it. I took a few slow steps toward the door, keeping my eyes on the opening. The air coming from outside was cold and I could see the curtain moving slightly. I placed my hand on the door and slowly pushed it until it was fully closed. The lock wasn't damaged or forced. Everything looked normal. That only made it stranger. I turned the key and heard the click, that sound that usually brings a sense of safety. But at that moment it didn't help much. I took a step back and stood there listening. The house was silent like it usually was in the afternoon. No TV, no movement, just that normal quiet. Even so, something didn't feel right. It was more of a feeling than anything concrete. I started looking around the kitchen, searching for any detail out of place. I paid closer attention to everything around me, trying to find a clearer sign that someone had been there. The sink looked the same as in the morning, no new dishes. The table was untouched. But even so, I couldn't relax. It felt like something was wrong, just without an obvious reason. I stood still for a few seconds, just listening, trying to catch any unusual sound. And that's when I heard it. It came from upstairs. A faint sound, almost imperceptible at first. Like a small shift. Like someone stepping lightly on wood. I froze instantly. It wasn't the kind of noise the house made on its own. It wasn't a normal creak. It was a step slow, controlled. I automatically lifted my head, looking toward the ceiling as if that would help me understand better. My heart started beating faster and I stood there waiting to hear it again. I stayed completely still in the middle of the kitchen, trying to listen more carefully as if any movement I made might interfere with the sound. My heart was pounding, and I felt that strange sense of alertness, like my body was reacting before my mind could fully understand the situation. A few seconds passed in silence, and then it came again, another step. Slow. Heavy enough not to be mistaken for something light but still controlled, like whoever was upstairs was trying not to make noise. At that moment, there was no denying it. There was someone on the second floor of the house, and it wasn't anyone who should have been there. I felt a chill run through my body, starting at the back of my neck and going down my spine. My first reaction was to think it could be one of my parents who had come back without telling me, but that didn't make sense. They always arrived by car and I hadn't heard anything in the garage, no door opening, nothing. And besides, the way the sound happened didn't match someone walking normally through the house. It was different, more careful, slower. I tried to decide what to do, but my mind felt frozen. Part of me wanted to run out the front door and just leave. Another part told me I might be overreacting and needed to check before doing anything. I took a few steps back automatically, moving away from the staircase that led to the second floor, as if that created some kind of safe distance. My eyes stayed fixed in that direction, waiting for any other movement. The silence returned for a few seconds, but it didn't feel normal. It was the kind of pause where you know something is still happening, you just can't see it. I tried to listen more closely, holding my breath for a moment, and then I heard it again. Another step, this time clearer, and it came from the direction of my parents' bedroom. At that moment, I felt a strong certainty that it wasn't someone from my family. It wasn't the way they walked, not the rhythm, not the weight of the step. It was different, slower, more deliberate. I started thinking about every possibility at once. Someone had come in through the back door, someone was still inside, someone was upstairs while I was alone in the house. My body reacted before I made any conscious decision. I slowly turned toward the front door, trying to make as little noise as possible, already deciding that leaving was the best option. I began walking toward the front door very slowly, trying not to make any sound that would reveal I had noticed something. Each step felt too loud even though I was being careful. The wooden floor creaked slightly, and I felt like any noise could draw attention from whoever was upstairs. My eyes kept darting back toward the staircase as if I expected to see someone coming down at any moment. My hand was already sweating when I reached the doorknob. I took a deep breath, trying to stay in control, thinking only about getting out as quickly as possible. But before I turned the handle, I heard another sound. Not from upstairs anymore, from the stairs. A slight shift, followed by a step. Closer now. I froze instantly, unable to complete the movement. That changed everything. It meant whoever was upstairs and was coming down. I didn't turn around. I didn't have the courage. I just stood there, hand on the door, trying not to move. The silence returned for a second, and then came another step. And another. Descending slowly, one stair at a time. I stood there with my hand on the doorknob, unable to turn it. My whole body locked up. The sound of the steps continued, now clearer, closer, matching the rhythm of the staircase. It wasn't fast. It wasn't someone rushing down. It was slow, controlled, like the person was aware of every movement. I could almost picture exactly where they were with each step, coming down one stair at a time. I tried to control my breathing, but it was difficult. Any sound I made felt too loud in that silence. At some point, the steps stopped. I didn't know exactly where on the staircase, but they were closer than before. I felt a presence behind me, even without looking. My instinct screamed for me to open the door and run, but my hands wouldn't respond. Then I heard a faint sound, like a shift of weight on the last step. That meant whoever was there had reached the bottom. They were on the same level as me, inside the house, just a few meters away. I couldn't stand waiting anymore. I turned the doorknob in one motion and opened the door, ready to run without looking back. The outside air hit my face instantly, and that gave me the push I needed. I stepped outside, but stopped the next second. Not by choice, my body froze again, because in the reflection on the glass of the door I saw movement behind me. I didn't look directly. Just in the reflection, a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway near the staircase. I didn't want to confirm it by turning around. I just left. I ran out of the house, down the porch steps, almost stumbling, and went straight to the street. I only stopped when I reached the sidewalk, far enough to feel like I had left that enclosed space. My heart was racing, my hands were shaking, and I stood there looking at the house from a distance, trying to understand what had just happened. The front door was left open, but no one came out. No movement at the windows, nothing. It was like the house had gone back to normal the moment I stepped outside. I stood there for a few minutes, not knowing what to do, until I finally found the courage to call my parents. When they arrived with the police hours later, they didn't find anyone. The house was intact, no forced doors, no broken windows. The back door was locked exactly as I had left it. They said it could have been someone who came in and left before being seen. But to this day, what I can't get out of my head is that the footsteps started upstairs, in my parents' bedroom. And I know exactly what it sounds like when someone enters a house, and that wasn't it. Story 3. I was 17 years old when this happened, and I lived with my parents in a very quiet residential neighborhood in Pennsylvania. It was the kind of street where everything goes silent after 9 at night. Few lights on, almost no car movement. That night I had gone out with some friends, nothing special, we just talked and drove around. I got back later than usual, close to 11:30. My parents were already asleep, so I tried to make as little noise as possible when I got home. The street was almost completely empty, with only a few streetlights casting uneven light. When I turned onto my street, still in the car, I saw something that immediately caught my attention. There was a car parked right in front of my house with the engine running. I noticed it from the faint vapor coming out of the exhaust and the low hum I could hear as I slowed down. That wasn't common there at that time. No one waited for anyone on that street, especially not in that spot. I slowed down, trying to observe without making it obvious. That's when I saw someone inside, a man sitting in the driver's seat looking toward my house. Right away, I felt that immediate discomfort, but I tried not to show it. I drove past the car as if it were just another parked vehicle and pulled into my driveway. I parked quickly, turned off the engine, and grabbed my things without looking back too much. Even so, I could feel that he was still there, just sitting, watching. When I got out of the car, the sound of his engine was clearer, steady, like it was just waiting. I didn't hear any door opening, no movement. He didn't get out of the car at any point. I walked to the front door, trying to act normal, but inside I was already much more alert. My hands were a little tense as I grabbed the key. Before opening the door, I took a quick glance toward the street, trying to be discreet. The car was still there, exactly in the same spot. And the man too. Even from a distance, I could tell he wasn't on his phone or doing anything else. He was looking, fixed, at the house. I went inside quickly, closed the door, and turned the key, hearing the lock click. That would normally make me feel safer, but not that time. I dropped my things on the living room floor and went straight to the window, trying to look without exposing myself too much. The lights inside the house were off, so I could see outside better than anyone could see me from inside. I pulled the curtain slightly aside and looked toward the car. It was still there. In the same place. Engine running, and the man was still inside in the same position. It didn't look like he was waiting for someone to come out, and he didn't look lost. It was like he was just there, watching. I felt that strange sensation of being evaluated, even without direct contact. I stayed there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to just ignore it and go to my room, pretend nothing was happening. But another part couldn't just let it go. It didn't make sense for that car to stay there for so long, especially with someone staring at the house. I grabbed my phone and thought about texting my parents, but I didn't want to wake them without being sure it was serious. So I kept watching, and time passed, and he didn't move. After a few minutes, I started to realize how long it had already been. This wasn't someone stopped for a few seconds or someone waiting for a quick call. It had been too long. The engine was still running steady, and he showed no intention of leaving. I started paying more attention to the details. His posture, the way his head was slightly tilted like he was focused on a specific point in the house. I tried to follow his line of sight, and realized it was roughly in the direction of the window where I had been before closing the curtain. That made me step back immediately. I let go of the curtain and took 2 steps back as if that would prevent him from seeing me. My heart started beating faster, and that feeling of discomfort turned into something clearer, fear. I stood in the middle of the living room for a few seconds, trying to decide whether I should turn on the lights or not. Part of me thought it might make him leave, another part thought it could make things worse. I stayed there doing nothing, just listening. The silence inside the house contrasted with the constant sound of the engine outside. I walked slowly around the living room, trying not to make noise, thinking about what to do next. I didn't want to turn on the lights and reveal where I was, so I kept everything dark. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a glass of water, more out of nerves than thirst, but my hands were slightly shaking. While I stood there, I tried to listen more carefully to what was happening outside. The sound of the engine was still there, steady, reinforcing that he hadn't left. I stood still for a few seconds, looking toward the front door as if that would give me some kind of answer. After a while, I went back to the window, this time being even more careful. I moved the curtain just enough to see. The car was still in the same place. Nothing had changed, but something felt different. It took me a second to realize what. The car's lights were off now. Before I could see a faint glow from the dashboard, something indicating it was on. Now it was completely dark inside. I frowned, trying to understand if he had turned off the car or just the interior lights. I kept looking for a few more seconds, trying to adjust my vision to the darkness. The car was still there, exactly in the same place, but now it was harder to see inside. Without that faint light from before, I could only make out the outline of the vehicle under the streetlight. I tried to focus on the driver's seat, looking for any movement, but I couldn't see anyone. That made me more tense than before. It wasn't like he had left. The car was still there, but now it looked empty. I moved a little closer to the window, trying to confirm if it was just the angle or if there was really no one inside. I leaned slightly, looking from another angle, trying to see the driver's seat better. Nothing. No movement, no silhouette. Just a dark interior. My stomach dropped instantly, because that meant one obvious thing I didn't want to accept. If he wasn't in the car anymore, then he was somewhere else. I stepped away from the window immediately, as if that would take me out of his line of sight even without knowing where he was. My whole body tensed, and I started looking around the living room as if it were possible to see someone inside. The house was still silent, but now that silence felt heavy, different from before. I tried to listen for any sound, any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no doors, no windows. Just the distant sound of the street, and now I couldn't even hear the car engine anymore. It was like everything had stopped at the same time. I stood in the middle of the room for a few seconds, trying to think clearly. My first instinct was to go to the door and check if it was properly locked. I walked slowly over and tested the handle. It was firm, locked. That gave me a small sense of security, but didn't solve the main problem. I didn't know where he was. I thought about going upstairs to my room, but the idea of being in a closed space without knowing if someone might already be inside the house made me even more uncomfortable. So I stayed there, trying to decide what to do. I remained there for a few more seconds, listening for anything unusual. That's when I heard a very faint sound from outside the house. It wasn't a clear step, nor something easy to identify. It was more like a slight shift, like someone moving along the wall. I froze instantly. My eyes went straight to the front door as if that would give me an answer. I held my breath, trying to hear better, and then it came again, closer this time. A short sound followed by silence. My body reacted before my mind. I took a step back, moving away from the door. The feeling that he was there, just on the other side, became very strong. I couldn't see anything, but it felt like someone was outside, standing there, maybe listening, maybe waiting. I thought about calling the police at that moment, but at the same time I didn't want to make noise. Didn't want him to know exactly where I was inside the house. I stared at the door, and then I heard a soft sound. A touch, not on the handle, on the wood. I stared at the door, unable to move. The touch was light, almost like someone was just placing their fingers against the wood to test it. I held my breath, waiting for another movement. And then it came again. Another touch in the same spot with the same care. This wasn't someone trying to break in or force their way inside. It was more like they were confirming something, like they knew I was in there. My heart started beating faster, and I felt that kind of fear you can't ignore. I took a few more steps back, moving away from the door, trying to keep distance. My mind was searching for a solution, anything that could fix the situation. Then I heard something even worse. It came from the side of the house. A faint dragging sound, like someone moving along the wall toward the windows. I turned my body instinctively, looking toward the living room window that faced the street. I didn't go there. I didn't have the courage. I just stood still, trying to listen. The sound stopped for a few seconds, and then came back, closer to the window. I stood there, unable to decide whether to go to the window or move further away. The sound stayed low, but I could tell it was moving. It was like someone sliding their hand along the wall while walking slowly. That didn't sound like someone lost or someone just passing by. It was deliberate. I felt a chill run through my body, especially when the sound stopped exactly at the height of the living room window. I held my breath again, waiting for something to happen. But nothing came for a few seconds. Then I heard a soft tap on the glass. Not loud, not like a knock, more like a touch with fingertips. Short, precise. I didn't move closer. I stayed where I was, staring in the direction of the window even without seeing anything. My body was completely tense, and that's when I realized what scared me the most about the situation. It wasn't just the fact that someone was outside. It was the way he moved. First in the car, then at the door, now at the window, like he was testing the house, trying to figure out exactly where I was. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my phone and called the police, speaking as quietly as I could, quickly explaining the situation. They arrived a few minutes later, though it felt much longer. When they got there and checked the area, they didn't find anyone. The car was gone. No sign that anyone had stayed nearby. They said it could have been someone trying to scare me or someone watching empty houses. But to this day, what stays with me isn't that. It's the sequence. The car, then empty. The touch on the door, then on the window. Like he was getting closer little by little and knew exactly where I was the entire time. Story 4. I was 15 years old when this happened, and I lived with my parents in a house in a residential neighborhood in New Jersey. It was a very quiet place with organized streets, good lighting, and those houses that are close to each other but still offer a lot of privacy. Our house had an intercom system with a camera at the front door, the kind that shows who's outside before you open it. My parents always emphasized that I should never open the door for anyone when I was alone, even with the intercom. That night they had gone out to dinner and were going to be back late, so I stayed home watching TV and using my phone, like I had done other times. Around a little after 9, I was in the hallway going to get something from the kitchen when I heard the sound of the intercom. It was that specific tone that comes from the wall, very different from a regular doorbell. I stopped immediately, a bit surprised because I wasn't expecting anyone. My parents hadn't mentioned any delivery and we rarely received anything at night. Even so, I walked over to the panel on the wall and looked at the camera screen. There was no one visible directly in front of the door, just the image of the entrance with the porch light on and the ground empty. That already made me uncomfortable, but before I could step away, a voice came through the intercom. The voice was male, low, but clear enough to understand. He just said delivery in a direct way without giving any more detail. I frowned immediately, because there was no one visible on the camera. I leaned a bit closer, trying to see if he was outside the frame. Maybe off to the side of the door, but I couldn't see anyone. The image showed only the empty entrance. That didn't make sense. Even so, I pressed the intercom button and responded, asking what the delivery was. My voice came out firmer than I expected, but inside I was already starting to feel uneasy. He took a second to respond, and when he did, he repeated the same thing, but in a slightly more drawn-out way. Delivery. He didn't say a name, didn't mention an address, nothing. I felt that internal alarm immediately. It was too vague, and the fact that no one was on the camera only made it worse. I said I wasn't expecting anything and that I wasn't going to open the door. For a few seconds there was no response, just that strange silence on the intercom, like the person was still there listening. I kept looking at the screen, waiting to see some movement, but nothing appeared. I was still staring at the screen when he spoke again, but this time his tone was different. It wasn't direct or neutral anymore. It was lower, more controlled, like he was carefully choosing each word. He said something like, "There's someone there, I know there is," without raising his voice, but in a way that made my entire body tense. That no longer sounded like someone making a delivery. I stayed silent for a few seconds, just staring at the camera image, trying to catch any unusual movement. Nothing. The entrance remained empty, lit with no one visible. I thought about simply turning off the intercom and ignoring it, but before I could do that, he spoke again. And that's when the situation really changed. He started describing what was inside the house. He said there was a light on in the hallway, exactly where I was standing at that moment. My stomach dropped instantly. That wasn't something he could see from the outside camera. There was no way he could know that just by looking from the front door. I looked around automatically, as if I might find someone inside the house, but there was no one. Just me, and even so, he knew exactly where I was. I froze in front of the intercom, staring at the screen while at the same time feeling like I was being watched from somewhere I couldn't see. My first instinct was to disconnect it, but my hand wouldn't move. I stood there, not knowing if any movement would make things worse. I tried to think logically, to understand where he could be seeing that from. Maybe through a window? Maybe he was somewhere along the side of the house, but there was no window that had a direct view of that hallway. And still, he knew. I took a step back without realizing it, trying to move out of that position. Then he spoke again, and this time he mentioned exactly what I had just done. He said something like, "You just stepped back." A chill ran through my body immediately. That couldn't be a coincidence. It wasn't possible he was guessing. He was seeing, but I couldn't understand from where. I quickly turned my head toward the living room, then to the other side of the hallway, trying to identify any angle from which someone could see that. There was no one. No strange reflections, no shadows, just the normal interior of the house, And that voice on the intercom, describing everything. My whole body went into that alert state. Like everything was slower and more intense at the same time. I didn't know whether to stay there or run to another room. Standing still felt wrong, but moving also felt risky. I took another step back, trying to get out of the line of sight of anything that might be watching, even without knowing where it was. My heart was racing and I started breathing faster without noticing. I just wanted to understand how that was possible. How someone outside, without appearing on camera, could know exactly where I was inside the house. And that's when he spoke again in an even calmer tone.
He described another detail.
He said I was near the wall, that the hallway light was on behind me. I turned immediately, looking at the light almost instinctively, and then I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The mirror at the end of the hallway. It was positioned in a way that reflected part of the space, including where I was. It wasn't a direct reflection of the door, but it gave a partial view. That gave me a kind of understanding, but at the same time it didn't solve everything. Because even then he would have to be at a very specific angle to see that from outside. And still, it didn't explain why I couldn't see him on the camera. I took another step back, trying to move completely out of that mirror's line, as if that could hide me somehow. My body was tense and my mind trying to piece together an explanation that made sense. If he was using the reflection, then he wasn't directly in front of the door. He had to be somewhere to the side outside the camera's field. That gave me a direction of thought, but it didn't bring any safety, because it meant he had chosen exactly where to stand in order to see inside the house without being seen. That didn't seem random. I looked again at the intercom screen, trying to detect any movement outside the frame. Still nothing. The image showed only the empty entrance, as if no one was there. Even so, the voice continued. He spoke again, now in a lower tone, almost as if he were very close to the microphone. He said he knew I was alone. That made my chest tighten instantly. It wasn't just about seeing anymore. It was about knowing. I didn't respond this time. I just stood there still, trying not to make any sound that would give him more information. My mind was racing, thinking about everything at once. I needed to get out of that spot where he knew exactly where I was. I took a slow step sideways, trying to leave the hallway and move toward the living room, where there was no mirror or direct line of sight from the door. I did it carefully, almost holding my breath as if any sound could be heard from the other side. The intercom stayed silent for a few seconds, and then he spoke again. He said something like, "Now you've left the hallway." That confirmed everything. He was really seeing. I felt a shock immediately because it was no longer a possibility. It was certainty. I quickly turned my body, looking around the living room, trying to find any point that could explain that. My first reaction was to think about windows. The house had some side windows, but all of them had curtains. Even so, the feeling that someone could be outside at some specific angle was strong. I started moving faster now, trying to get completely out of any possible line of sight. I went straight to the kitchen, more out of instinct than a clear plan. It was the only place in the house where I was sure there were no mirrors or direct view from the front door. I leaned against the wall for a few seconds, trying to regain control of my breathing and think about what to do. My phone was in my pocket, and this time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it and started calling my parents, but before the call connected, I heard the intercom again. Not the voice, the click, like someone had pressed the button once more. I didn't go back to answer it. I stayed where I was, silent, just listening. And then the voice came again, but now lower, closer, almost like he was speaking directly through the door. He said something that made me freeze instantly. He said I didn't need to answer the intercom for him to know where I was now. That didn't make any sense. I was out of the hallway, out of the reflection. There was no way he could see me. And still, he knew. I turned off the intercom from the kitchen panel without responding and kept trying to call my parents. The call took a few seconds to connect, and those seconds felt much longer than they should have. While the phone rang, I stayed completely still in the kitchen, trying not to make any sound. I couldn't hear his voice on the intercom anymore, which didn't bring any relief. It only made everything more uncertain. When my mom finally answered, I spoke quickly, quietly explaining what was happening, trying not to panic. She told me to lock everything and call the police immediately. I already had my hand on the phone when I heard a sound that made everything worse. It came from outside. Not from the intercom anymore. A faint dragging noise along the side of the house, like someone moving along the wall. I turned my head automatically toward the back door, even though I knew I couldn't see anything from there. The sound stopped for a few seconds, and then came back closer. I felt that awful certainty that he wasn't just at the front of the house anymore. He was moving around it, looking for another point. I hung up with my mom and dialed emergency services, trying to speak as quietly as possible, explaining the situation. I stayed on the phone with the operator, speaking softly but urgently. I quickly explained that someone was outside the house using the intercom and moving around. While I spoke, I kept listening. The sound came and went, always near the wall, like he was testing the limits of the house, moving along each side slowly. I felt my whole body tense, ready to react, but not knowing how. The operator told me to stay in a safe place and said a patrol car was already on the way. I didn't leave the kitchen. I stayed there, leaning against the wall, phone in hand, trying to control my breathing. At some point, the sound outside stopped completely. The silence returned, but it didn't feel safe. It felt more like a pause. I waited a few seconds, and then I heard a light touch. Not on the front door, not on the intercom. It came from the back door. A short tap on the wood. My stomach dropped instantly. That confirmed he had gone all the way around the house. The police arrived a few minutes later, but it felt much longer. When they checked the area, they didn't find anyone. No sign of forced entry, no one nearby. They said it could have been someone trying to scare me or someone watching houses. But to this day, what bothers me the most isn't that. It's the fact that he knew exactly where I was inside the house in real time, without ever appearing on the camera. Story 5. I was 13 years old when this happened, and I lived with my parents in a regular 2-story house in a residential neighborhood in Michigan. It wasn't an isolated place, but it also wasn't busy at night. It was the kind of street where after a certain hour, you only hear an occasional car passing and nothing else. That night, my parents had gone out to visit some friends and were going to be back late. I was already used to staying alone for a few hours, so it wasn't anything new for me. I had dinner, organized my things, and was in my room playing video games, trying to enjoy the silence of the house. Around midnight, I was still awake, with my room lit only by the glow of the TV. The house was completely silent, as it usually was at that time. All the doors were locked, because my parents always insisted on that before leaving. I clearly remembered checking both the front and back doors before going to my room. At some point, while I was playing, I heard a strange sound. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to catch my attention. It sounded like metal being forced, like when someone tries to mess with a doorknob or a lock. But it wasn't coming from outside the house. It came from inside. I paused the game immediately and stayed completely still, just listening. At first, I tried to convince myself it could be some normal house noise, pipes, the refrigerator, or something lightly falling. But it didn't sound like that. It was too specific. It was a metallic sound, short but with that sense of resistance, like something was being turned or forced. I stayed silent for a few seconds, waiting to hear it again. And then it came. Once more, a little clearer this time, and definitely not coming from outside. My heart started beating faster, and I slowly took off my headphones to make sure I could hear everything around me. The sound seemed to come from the lower part of the house, more specifically from the direction of the kitchen, and near the kitchen was the door that led to the basement. I felt an immediate discomfort because that door was always kept closed and no one had any reason to be messing with it at that hour. I sat on the bed for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it and stay in my room. The other part told me something wasn't right. I sat there for what felt like longer than it really was, trying to decide whether to get up or not. The silence returned for a few seconds, which almost convinced me it had been nothing. But then it came again, the same metallic sound, more drawn out this time, like someone was trying to open something carefully without making much noise. That was enough to remove any doubt. I knew exactly where it was coming from now. The basement door. A chill ran through my body instantly. The idea that someone could be inside the house in a place that should have been closed didn't make sense. I tried to think of simple explanations. Maybe my parents had come back without me noticing. Maybe there was something wrong with the door. But none of those matched the sound. It was too specific. I got up from the bed very slowly, trying not to make noise, and went to my bedroom door. I opened it just a little, enough to look into the hallway. Everything was dark, just as I had left it. No lights on downstairs. I opened the door a bit more and stepped out, trying to hear better. The hallway was completely dark, with only a faint light from the street coming through a distant window. I stood there trying to adjust my vision, looking toward the staircase that led down to the living room. Nothing moved, no sound at that moment. that almost made me think it had stopped. Until I heard it again, lower now but still coming from downstairs. And it wasn't just the metallic sound anymore. There was another noise with it, like wood being pushed. My stomach dropped instantly. That sounded like the basement door opening. I knew exactly what that door sounded like, because it always creaked a little when someone opened it. And what I was hearing now was very similar, but more controlled, like someone was trying to open it slowly without drawing attention. I stood completely still in the middle of the hallway, not knowing whether to go back to my room or go downstairs to check. My heart was pounding, and I started to feel that sense that any wrong decision could make everything worse. I took a few more steps down the hallway very slowly, trying not to make noise. Each step felt too loud in the silence of the house. My focus was entirely on the staircase because from there I could see part of the kitchen. And the basement door was right next to it. I approached the top of the stairs and stopped, holding onto the railing, trying to look without exposing myself too much. The lighting downstairs was minimal, just enough to make out shapes. But it was enough to see something that made my body freeze. The basement door was open, not completely, but enough to leave a dark gap there. I was sure that door had been closed before. I hadn't gone downstairs that night and no one else was in the house. It couldn't have opened by itself. I stared at that opening, waiting to see some movement, and for a few seconds nothing happened, just that deep darkness coming from the basement. And then I heard it. A sound from inside, a step slow climbing. The sound was clear this time. A heavy step on wood coming from below, moving upward. My whole body locked instantly. There was no doubt anymore that someone was down there. And it didn't sound like someone in a hurry. It was slow, controlled, one step at a time. I stood at the top of the stairs, unable to move, just listening. The silence between each step was worse than the sound itself, because it felt like the person was listening for any reaction from me. I started backing away automatically, stepping backward without taking my eyes off the staircase. I didn't want to be visible from there. I didn't want whoever was coming up to see me standing in that spot. My heart was beating so loudly it felt like it filled the entire silence of the house. I took a few more steps back until I reached the hallway again, trying to put as much distance as possible without making noise. But even as I moved away, I could still hear it. Another step, then another, closer now, climbing slowly, approaching the same level as the rest of the house. I kept backing up until I reached my bedroom door, without taking my focus off the sound coming from the stairs. Each step sounded closer, clearer, like whoever it was almost at the last step. My whole body was tense, as if any wrong movement would reveal exactly where I was. I didn't have the courage to run, or to close the door forcefully. Everything had to be as quiet as possible. When I reached the doorknob, I opened my bedroom door slowly and went inside, closing it without making noise. I leaned against the door for a few seconds, trying to control my breathing, but I couldn't relax. The sound continued, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than anything, because it didn't mean he had left. It meant he had arrived. I stared at the door, waiting to hear any movement in the hallway. And then it came. A faint sound, not footsteps, but presence, like someone moving very close to the door. And right after that, a touch. The touch was light, almost like someone was testing the surface of the door with their fingertips. It wasn't a knock from someone trying to come in, nor anything rushed. It was slow, calculated. A chill ran through my body instantly, and I stayed completely still, barely even blinking. My breathing was shallow, and I tried to control it as much as possible to avoid making any sound. A few seconds passed, and then it came again. Another touch in the same spot, as if the person on the other side knew exactly where I was leaning. I stared at the doorknob, waiting for any movement, any sign that he would try to open it. But nothing happened for a few seconds. Just that heavy silence, and then the doorknob moved, very slowly. It wasn't someone turning it forcefully or trying to break in. It was a light movement testing it, like someone checking if it was locked. My whole body froze completely. The doorknob stopped, and then moved again. A little firmer this time. I held my breath, expecting the worst. The doorknob suddenly stopped moving, as if the person had given up, or decided something else. The silence returned, but it brought no relief. I stayed there, pressed against the door, unable to move, just listening, trying to catch any sound in the hallway. A few seconds passed, and then I heard footsteps, not coming down like before. Now they were moving away from my door, heading in the opposite direction down the hallway, slowly, without urgency, like whoever was there already knew I wouldn't come out. I didn't leave the room for a long time after that. I don't even know how long I stayed there leaning against the door, just listening and waiting for any other sound. At some point, the exhaustion and silence made me lose track of time. When my parents came home later that night, I told them everything. They checked the whole house along with the police, but they didn't find anyone. No forced doors, no open windows, nothing out of place, except for the basement door. It was unlocked. And to this day, what bothers me the most isn't just the fact that someone got in. It's that the first sound I heard came from inside the house, as if he was already there, before I even realized. Story 6. I was 16 years old when this happened, and I lived with my parents in a single-story house in a residential neighborhood in Kentucky. It was a typical house with a low roof, the kind that makes noise easily when it rains. That week, my parents were traveling to visit relatives, and I stayed home alone for 2 nights. It had happened before, so I wasn't nervous about it. In fact, at first, I even thought it would be nice. I had planned to play video games, order food, and stay up late. During the day, everything was completely normal. But at night, the atmosphere changed a bit because of the rain. Around 10 at night, it started raining harder. It wasn't a heavy storm, but it was constant with that steady sound hitting the roof. I was in my room, with the lights off and only the TV on, playing and trying to ignore the sound of the rain. At a certain point, I started noticing a different sound mixed in with the rain. At first, it seemed like just a variation of the roof itself, like when water builds up and runs off. But then it became clearer. They were footsteps, heavy enough to stand out from the sound of the rain, and they were coming from above, from the roof. I paused the game immediately and took off my headphones, trying to be sure of what I was hearing. I sat on the bed in silence, paying close attention. At first, the footsteps seemed irregular, almost blending with the rain. But the more I focused, the clearer it became. It wasn't random. There was a pattern. One step, pause, another step, like someone walking back and forth carefully but not trying to be completely silent. It didn't make any sense. There was no reason for someone to be on the roof of the house in the middle of the night, especially in the rain. My first thought was to explain it logically, maybe some large animal like a raccoon or something like that, but the weight didn't feel like a small animal. It was heavier, more solid, and the rhythm was too controlled. I spent a few seconds trying to rationalize it, but I couldn't fit it into any normal explanation. I got out of bed slowly without making noise and instinctively looked up, as if I could somehow see through the ceiling. The footsteps continued, going from one side to the other, like someone was walking over my room. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide if this could be something normal that I was misinterpreting. But the more I listened, the less it seemed like anything ordinary. The footsteps weren't fast or chaotic. They were firm, one at a time, like someone walking carefully so as not to slip, but still with enough weight to make the roof respond. I started to feel that kind of alertness that comes before full fear, when you're still trying to deny it but already know something isn't right. I took a few steps around the room, trying to hear from a different angle. The footsteps continued, but now they seemed closer to one specific side, as if the person was moving toward the center of the roof. I stopped right in the middle of the room, looking around without knowing what to do. The idea of leaving the house crossed my mind, but going out in the rain without knowing what was out there didn't feel safe either. I thought about calling someone, but before making any decision, the sound changed. The footsteps became more spaced out, slower, and then started to stop. The silence came suddenly, as if someone had stopped exactly where they were. I stared at the ceiling without blinking, trying to catch any other sound. Nothing. Just the constant rain filling everything. That didn't bring me any relief. In fact, it did the opposite, because it meant the person, or whatever it was, hadn't left. It had just stopped. And from the way the footsteps had been, I knew exactly where. Right above my room. My body stiffened immediately. My heart started beating faster, and I tried to control my breathing so I wouldn't make any noise. I stayed completely still, waiting for any sign of movement. A few seconds passed, and then it came. A faint sound, very different from the footsteps. A tap, not on the roof, on the window, from the outside. I turned my head immediately, looking toward my bedroom window. And before I even moved closer, I heard it again. Another tap, slow, precise, like someone tapping the glass with their fingertips. I stood in the middle of the room for a few seconds, trying to understand what was happening. My brain couldn't connect the two things. The person was on the roof, and now they were at the window. It didn't make sense because that window didn't have easy access from the roof without making noise, without sliding, without some kind of more obvious movement. But the sound was there. Clear, close. I didn't approach right away. I just stood there looking toward the window, my heart racing, waiting to hear it again. And it came, another tap. This time more drawn out, like someone slowly dragging their hand across the glass. A chill ran through my body instantly. That didn't feel like someone trying to get in. It felt like someone testing, feeling the space. I took a step back automatically, moving away from the window. Part of me wanted to pull the curtain open all at once and see what was outside. The other part told me not to do that. I stood there torn for a few seconds until the sound stopped again, and the silence returned. I stared at the window for a few seconds, waiting for any movement, any shadow passing by the curtain. But nothing came. The silence continued, with only the sound of rain filling the rest. That almost made me think it had stopped for good, that maybe it had been some kind of illusion caused by the constant noise, but I knew it wasn't. The sound had been too clear, too precise. I took a deep breath and very slowly stepped toward the window, trying not to make noise. I got close enough to see the curtain moving slightly, with the air coming through some small gap. My hand hovered for a second before touching the fabric. I hesitated. I didn't want to see what was on the other side, but at the same time I needed to confirm. I pulled the curtain just a little, enough to look. The part illuminated by the streetlight showed only the rain falling and the empty backyard. No person, no silhouette, nothing. That didn't bring relief. It only made the feeling worse, because it meant that if someone had been there, they were no longer visible. I kept looking for a few more seconds, trying to find any sign of movement in the yard, but there was nothing. Just the rain hitting the ground and surfaces, creating that constant sound. I closed the curtain slowly, trying not to make noise, and took a few steps back. My body was still tense, as if expecting the sound to return at any moment. And it did, but not at the window. It came from above again, the footsteps, but now closer, more concentrated. They were no longer moving back and forth. They were almost in the same spot, and that spot was exactly above my window. My stomach dropped instantly. It was as if the person had gone back up to the roof after being at the window, or as if they had never left. I couldn't understand how that was possible, but the pattern was clear. Step, pause, another step, always in the same place. I stood in the middle of the room, not knowing whether to move or not. The sound continued above me, always in that same spot, as if the person was adjusting their position or trying to balance. The rain hadn't lessened, which made it even stranger that someone could be up there without slipping, without making more noise. I tried to imagine how someone could have gotten up there without me noticing earlier, but nothing made sense. I started looking around the room as if I could find some kind of answer there, but there was nothing that helped. And then the sound stopped again. The silence came quickly, cutting off the footsteps all at once. I held my breath, waiting for the next movement, and it came, but not from above. It came from the window again. A tap, slower now, more dragged, as if whoever was outside was more certain of what they were doing. I didn't approach this time. I stayed where I was, staring at the window, feeling that fear grow in a way that's hard to explain. I didn't wait for anything else after that. I grabbed my phone and called the police, speaking as quietly as I could, explaining that someone was on the roof and at the window. They arrived a few minutes later, but to me it felt much longer. When they checked the house, they found no one. No signs on the roof, no footprints, nothing out of place. They said it could have been some animal, but I know the difference in sound. And to this day, what bothers me the most isn't even the noise, it's the way it moved. First on the roof, then at the window, as if it knew exactly where I was the entire time.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.